I never thought the sight of construction trucks pulling up to my property would fill me with dread. But that's exactly what happened on that humid Tuesday morning in June when I looked out my kitchen window and saw 3 dump trucks backing onto my vacant lot in suburban Phoenix, Arizona. My name is Xavier Ingram, and I'd bought this second lot next to my house about 2 years ago with plans to eventually build a workshop. The land sat empty for now, just scrub brush and desert sand. But it was mine. Or at least, I thought I had full control over what happened on it until the Saguaro Heights Homeowners Association decided otherwise. I walked outside in my shorts and t-shirt, coffee mug still in hand, watching these guys unload what looked like chunks of old building materials. Broken drywall, insulation, pipes, all sorts of construction debris. The workers barely glanced at me as they operated the hydraulic lifts, dumping load after load onto my property. "Hey!" I shouted, jogging over. "What the hell are you doing?" One of the workers, a younger guy with a bandana wrapped around his head, looked at me with confusion. "HOA contracted us to dump this stuff here. You got a problem, take it up with them." "This is my property. Nobody asked me about this." He shrugged and pulled out a crumpled work order from his back pocket. "Says right here, Lot 47, Saguaro Heights. That's this address. We're just doing what we were paid to do, man." I grabbed my phone and immediately called the HOA office. It rang 4 times before someone picked up. "Saguaro Heights HOA, this is Margaret speaking." The voice was clipped, efficient, and immediately irritating. "Margaret, this is Xavier Ingram from 2847 Desert View Road. There are dump trucks on my vacant lot right now, dumping construction debris. What's going on?" "Oh, Mr. Ingram. Yes, we sent you a notice about this 3 weeks ago. The HOA is undergoing renovations at the community center, and we've designated your lot as a temporary staging area for materials." My jaw nearly hit the ground. "You did what? You can't just use my private property as your dump site." Actually, if you review your HOA bylaws, Article 12, Section 4, the association reserves the right to utilize vacant lots within the community for operational needs. We've been very clear about this. I never agreed to that, and I never got any notice. The notice was sent via standard mail. If you didn't receive it, that's a postal issue, not our problem. The work order has been approved by the board, and it's happening. The debris will only be there temporarily, perhaps a few weeks. Then, we'll have it removed. A few weeks? Margaret, you need to stop them right now and get this stuff off my land. I'm afraid that's not possible. The crews are already there and we've paid for the service. Have a good day, Mr. Ingram." She hung up before I could respond. I stood there, phone in hand, watching these workers continue to dump load after load of trash onto my lot. My lot. The property I'd worked hard to buy, spent my savings on, and these people thought they could just use it as their personal landfill. By noon, 3 full truckloads had been dumped. The pile was massive, maybe 20 feet high and spreading across a good portion of the lot. I'd called the HOA office 6 more times, only to be told Margaret was unavailable or in a meeting. I left increasingly angry voice messages that I knew were probably being deleted without a second listen. My neighbor Joe came over around 1 in the afternoon. He was a retired electrician, good guy, been in the neighborhood for 15 years. "Xavier, what's all this?" he asked, gesturing at the mountain of debris. "HOA decided my lot is their dumping ground. Didn't ask, didn't care. Just showed up and started unloading." Joe whistled low. "That's rough, man. You know, I worked on some of that community center renovation last month. They were pulling out a lot of old materials. That place was built in the 70s. If they're gutting it, there might be some nasty stuff in there." "Nasty stuff like what?" "Asbestos, lead paint, old insulation. Buildings from that era, you never know. They're supposed to have it tested and disposed of properly if it contains hazardous materials." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. "You think this could have asbestos in it?" "I'm just saying, if they're renovating a building that old, they should be careful. Did they have an environmental assessment done?" "I have no idea. The HOA president, Margaret, she just told me they had the right to dump here and that was that." Joe shook his head. "You might want to look into that. Asbestos isn't something to mess around with. If those fibers get airborne, you're looking at serious health risks. Lung cancer, mesothelioma, all kinds of bad news." After Joe left, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I grabbed a dust mask from my garage and walked closer to the pile, being careful not to touch anything. The debris looked old, weathered. There were chunks of what appeared to be ceiling tiles, insulation batting that looked suspiciously like it could contain asbestos, old pipe wrapping. None of it was sealed or contained properly. It was just sitting there, exposed to the elements, in the Arizona wind that could carry those fibers anywhere. I took photos from every angle: the pile, the trucks, the workers' company name on the side of the vehicles, Desert Disposal Solutions. I documented everything with timestamps. That evening, I drove to the HOA office. It was located in a small strip mall about 2 miles from my house, wedged between a nail salon and a tax preparation service. The office was technically closed at 5, but I could see lights on inside. I knocked hard on the glass door. Margaret appeared, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun. She looked to be in her mid-50s, wearing a blazer that screamed, "I want to speak to the manager" energy. She opened the door just a crack. "We're closed, Mr. Ingram. We need to talk about what you dumped on my property. I've already explained the situation. There's nothing more to discuss. Did you have that material tested for asbestos before you dumped it?" Something flickered in her eyes. Uncertainty. Maybe fear. "That's not your concern." "It absolutely is my concern when you're dumping potentially hazardous materials on my land. Show me the environmental assessment." "We don't have to show you anything. The board approved this action, and it's within our rights. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." She tried to close the door, but I wedged my foot in. "Margaret, if that material contains asbestos and you dumped it without proper handling, you're violating federal environmental laws. This isn't just an HOA issue anymore. This is a crime. Remove your foot or I'm calling the police." I pulled back. "Fine, but this isn't over." I spent that entire night researching federal regulations, EPA guidelines, Arizona state laws regarding asbestos disposal. What I learned made my blood run cold. Asbestos-containing materials from renovation projects are strictly regulated. They must be tested, properly contained, transported by licensed carriers, and disposed of at approved facilities. You can't just dump it wherever you feel like it. The penalties for improper disposal were severe: fines up to $25,000 per day of violation and potential criminal charges. If Margaret and the HOA board had knowingly dumped asbestos-containing materials on my property, they'd committed a serious federal offense. The next morning, I called Desert Disposal Solutions. A woman answered on the third ring. "Desert Disposal? How can I help you?" "Hi, my name is Xavier Ingram. Your crews dumped material on my property yesterday, and I need some information about the contract." "Hold, please." Music played for about 2 minutes before a man's voice came on. "This is Rick, operations manager. What can I do for you?" "Your crews dumped construction debris on my lot at 2847 Desert View Road. I need to know what your contract with the HOA says about the material." "Sir, I can't discuss contract details with third parties." "It's my property. I think I have a right to know what you dumped on it." Rick sighed. "Look, we were hired to remove and dispose of renovation debris from the Saguaro Heights Community Center. The HOA told us to take it to that lot. We followed our work order." "Was the material tested for asbestos?" Silence. Then, carefully, "We were told it was clean." "But you didn't test it yourself?" "That's not our responsibility. The property owner is supposed to have that done before we touch anything. We just haul it." "So the HOA was responsible for testing it?" "That's standard procedure, yeah." "And if they told you it was clean but it actually wasn't, what happens?" Another pause. "Then we've got a problem. But like I said, we were assured it was safe to handle." I thanked him and hung up. The picture was becoming clearer. The HOA had authorized the removal of materials from an old building without proper testing, lied about it being safe, and dumped it illegally on my property. They'd put the disposal crew at risk, put me at risk, put my entire neighborhood at risk. I needed proof. That afternoon, I waited until I saw Margaret's car leave the HOA office. Then I drove over, parked around back, and approached the building. The office shared a common wall with the tax place, and there was a small alley between them. I wasn't planning to break in, but the back door was propped open with a brick. Someone must have been taking out trash or getting fresh air. I'm not proud of what I did next, but sometimes you have to bend the rules when people are putting lives at risk. I slipped inside. The back room was cluttered with filing cabinets, old furniture, and boxes of documents. I moved quickly, quietly, searching for anything related to the community center renovation. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then I found it. A filing cabinet labeled Projects 2026. Inside was a folder marked Community Center Renovation. I pulled it out and started flipping through. There were contractor bids, building permits, architectural plans, and then, jackpot, a memo from the general contractor to the HOA board dated 6 weeks ago. The subject line read, "Required asbestos inspection." I pulled out my phone and started photographing every page. The memo explained that due to the age of the community center, an asbestos inspection was required before any demolition work began. It would cost $1,500. The contractor was waiting for approval to hire a certified inspector. I flipped to the next page, an email from Margaret to the board members. "This inspection is an unnecessary expense. The building looks fine. I recommend we proceed with demolition immediately and save the money. We can dispose of the materials ourselves using vacant lots in the community." My hands were shaking as I photographed that email. She'd knowingly skipped the required inspection to save money and had decided to use homeowners' lots as illegal dump sites. I found more documents, the contract with Desert Disposal Solutions, which specifically stated that all materials were non-hazardous and cleared for standard disposal. A complete lie. There was no inspection report because they'd never done an inspection. I also found a list of approved temporary staging areas. My lot was on it, along with 3 other vacant lots in the community. Mine was just the first. I photographed everything, stuffed the folder back where I found it, and slipped out the back door. My heart didn't stop racing until I was 5 blocks away. That night, I organized all my evidence. Photos of the dump site, photos of the documents, recordings of my phone calls, Joe's statement about asbestos concerns in buildings from that era. I had everything I needed. The next morning, I called the EPA's Region 9 office, which covers Arizona. I was transferred 3 times before I reached someone in the Asbestos Enforcement Division. "This is Agent Paulo Rodriguez. I understand you have a complaint about illegal asbestos disposal." I explained everything. The unauthorized dump on my property, the HOA's failure to conduct required testing, the contractor's memo, Margaret's emails, the whole situation. "Mr. Ingram, these are serious allegations. Do you have documentation?" "I have photos of everything. Emails, memos, contracts, the dump site itself. I can send them all to you." "Please do. Send them to the email address I'm about to give you. We'll review the materials and determine if an investigation is warranted." I sent everything within the hour. Then I waited. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was Agent Rodriguez. Batio. "Mr. Ingram, we've reviewed your submission. We're opening a formal investigation. I need to inform you that the material on your property needs to be tested immediately. Until we know what we're dealing with, I'm recommending you stay away from it and keep others away as well. We're sending a certified inspector out tomorrow morning. What happens if it tests positive for asbestos? Then we have a major environmental violation on our hands. The EPA will oversee proper remediation and will be pursuing enforcement action against all responsible parties." The inspector arrived the next morning in an EPA vehicle. His name was David Chen, and he wore a full hazmat suit as he approached the pile. He took samples from multiple locations, sealed them in specialized containers, and told me results would be ready within 48 hours. "Between you and me," he said as he was packing up, "this looks exactly like asbestos-containing material. The pipe insulation, those ceiling tiles, the texture of that batting. If I were betting, I'd say we've got a positive result coming." My stomach sank. It was one thing to suspect it, another to hear an expert confirm it. What does that mean for me, for my property? It means you've got contaminated land that needs professional remediation. The good news is that since you didn't cause the contamination, the responsible parties will be liable for all cleanup costs. The bad news is that it's going to be a process. Full remediation can take weeks or months depending on the extent of contamination. I called a lawyer that afternoon. Her name was Melissa Wright, and she specialized in environmental law. I'd found her through a legal referral service, and her reviews were excellent. Mr. Ingram, based on what you're telling me, you have a strong case for multiple causes of action. Trespass, property damage, possibly personal injury if you or anyone else was exposed to asbestos fibers. The HOA is absolutely liable, and if they acted with gross negligence or willful misconduct, we could be looking at punitive damages. What about criminal charges? That's up to the EPA and potentially the state attorney general. Illegal dumping of hazardous materials is a federal crime. If they knowingly dumped asbestos without proper handling, they're looking at serious penalties. Prison time is possible for the decision makers. Margaret, the HOA president. If she made the decision, she's potentially criminally liable. So are any board members who approved or knew about it. I hired Melissa on the spot. The EPA called 3 days later with the test results. Agent Rodriguez's voice was grim. Mr. Ingram, all 12 samples tested positive for asbestos. We're looking at chrysotile asbestos in the insulation, amosite in the pipe wrapping, and asbestos-containing material in the ceiling tiles and some of the drywall. This is a significant hazmat situation. What happens now? We're issuing an emergency cleanup order. The site will be secured immediately. No one goes near it. We're also issuing a violation notice to the Saguaro Heights HOA. They'll be required to pay for complete remediation by a licensed asbestos abatement contractor. We're talking probably $150,000 to $200,000 for proper cleanup. I let out a low whistle. And the criminal aspect? I'm forwarding the case to our Criminal Investigation Division. They'll work with the U.S. Attorney's Office to determine if criminal charges are warranted. Based on the evidence you provided, particularly those emails showing they knowingly skipped the inspection, I'd say charges are likely. That afternoon, EPA personnel arrived and cordoned off my lot with hazmat tape and warning signs. They put up chain-link fencing around the perimeter. Neighbors started coming out to see what was happening. I explained the situation to at least a dozen people, watching their faces shift from curiosity to horror as they realized what had been dumped in their neighborhood. Joe came over again that evening. I heard EPA was here. It was asbestos. All of it, every sample. Jesus, and Margaret dumped it without testing? Deliberately. She didn't want to spend the money on an inspection. Joe's face darkened. That woman is something else. You know she's been president for 6 years? Runs that HOA like her personal fiefdom. People have complained about her before, but she always manages to stay in power. Maybe this will finally take her down. The next morning, I got a call from an unknown number. Mr. Ingram, this is Thomas Brennan. I'm an attorney representing the Saguaro Heights HOA. We need to discuss this situation. I have my own attorney. You can talk to her. Please, just give me a moment. The board is extremely concerned about the EPA investigation. We believe there may have been a misunderstanding. Perhaps we can reach an agreement that would be mutually beneficial. A misunderstanding. You dumped asbestos on my property. The board wasn't aware that the material hadn't been properly tested. This was an oversight by our president, Margaret Henderson. The board is taking immediate action to address the situation. What kind of action? Margaret is being removed as president effective immediately. We're also prepared to offer you a settlement for any damages or distress this has caused. Your client committed a federal crime. No settlement is going to make that go away. Mr. Ingram, please be reasonable. The HOA is a nonprofit organization. Our funds come from homeowner dues. If the EPA fines us hundreds of thousands of dollars, it will bankrupt the association. Everyone's property values will suffer. Maybe you should have thought about that before you let Margaret use people's land as an illegal dump site. How many other lots were on her list? 3? 4? Silence. Then, how did you know about the list? I didn't answer. Mr. Ingram, whatever you think you know, I strongly advise you to work with us. This can be resolved quietly. No, it can't. Not anymore. The EPA is investigating. Criminal charges are coming. You can't settle your way out of this. I hung up and immediately called Melissa. They're trying to pressure me into some kind of settlement. The HOA's lawyer just called. Don't talk to them. Direct all communication through me. They're trying to limit their exposure, but it's too late. The federal government is involved now. That evening, Margaret showed up at my door. She looked different, smaller somehow. The imperious attitude was gone, replaced by something that almost looked like desperation. Mr. Ingram, please, can we talk? Through lawyers. Just give me 5 minutes, please. Against my better judgment, I stepped outside but didn't invite her in. I made a mistake, she said. I know that now. I was trying to save money for the association. The inspection seemed like an unnecessary expense, and I thought I was doing the right thing. You knowingly skipped a required environmental inspection and dumped hazardous materials on my property. That's not a mistake. That's a crime. I didn't know it was asbestos. I genuinely thought it was safe. You didn't want to know. That's the problem. You could have done the testing, but you chose not to because you didn't want to deal with the results, and then you tried to hide the evidence by dumping it on lots where you thought no one would notice. Her face crumpled. I'm going to lose everything. My position, my reputation. They're talking about criminal charges. I could go to prison. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. You put people's lives at risk. My life, my neighbors' lives, the workers who handled that material. Asbestos causes cancer. Did you think about that when you made your decision? I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't fix this. Sorry doesn't clean up the contamination or undo the exposure. You need to leave. She stood there for a moment longer, tears running down her face, then turned and walked back to her car. I watched her drive away and felt nothing but relief that she was gone. The EPA investigation moved quickly. Within a week, they'd interviewed Margaret, the board members, and the contractors. The emails I'd photographed were authenticated and became central evidence. The Criminal Investigation Division issued a report recommending prosecution. In late July, the U.S. Attorney's Office announced charges. Margaret was indicted on 4 counts: knowing endangerment under the Clean Air Act, illegal disposal of hazardous waste, conspiracy to violate environmental laws, and making false statements to federal investigators. She'd apparently lied during her EPA interview about when she knew the material might contain asbestos. 2 board members who'd approved her plan were also charged with conspiracy and illegal disposal. They claimed they'd trusted Margaret's judgment and didn't know she'd skipped the inspection, but the emails showed they'd been part of the discussion about cutting costs. The remediation began in August. A specialized asbestos abatement company brought in crews wearing full hazmat gear. They carefully wetted down all the material to prevent fiber release, sealed it in specially marked bags and containers, and transported it to a licensed hazardous waste facility in Nevada. They also tested the soil underneath the pile and found contamination in the top 6 inches, which had to be excavated and disposed of as well. The process took 6 weeks and cost $187,000. The HOA's insurance denied the claim because the dumping had been intentional, so the association had to take out a loan secured against future dues to pay for it. Every homeowner in Saguaro Heights got hit with a special assessment of $800 to cover the costs. People were furious. A recall election was held, and the entire board was replaced. The new president was a retired accountant named Sarah who promised complete transparency and strict adherence to all laws and regulations. My lawsuit against the HOA was settled in October. Melissa negotiated a payment of $75,000 for property damage, loss of use, emotional distress, and attorney's fees. The HOA also had to pay for independent air quality testing in my home and Joe's home, plus any medical monitoring recommended for me and my immediate neighbors. Fortunately, the air tests came back clean. Because the pile had only been there for a few days and I'd reported it quickly, there hadn't been significant fiber dispersal. Margaret's criminal trial was scheduled for January 2027, but she accepted a plea deal in December 2026. She pled guilty to 2 counts: knowing endangerment and illegal disposal of hazardous waste. The sentencing guidelines called for 18 to 24 months in federal prison plus substantial fines. Her lawyer argued for probation, citing her age, lack of criminal history, and remorse, but the judge wasn't sympathetic. I attended the sentencing hearing. It was held in the federal courthouse in downtown Phoenix, an imposing building with marble floors and high ceilings. Margaret sat at the defense table looking small and defeated. She'd aged visibly in the months since the incident, her hair now streaked with gray, her face lined with stress. The prosecutor laid out the case methodically. The knowing decision to skip required testing, the deliberate dumping on private property, the endangerment of public health, the attempted cover-up. When it was Margaret's turn to speak, she stood shakily. "Your Honor, I know I made terrible decisions. I thought I was helping my community by saving money, but I realize now that I put people at risk. I'm deeply sorry for what I did. I take full responsibility." The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Patricia Walsh, looked at her coldly. "Ms. Henderson, you held a position of trust in your community. Homeowners relied on you to make decisions in their best interests. Instead, you violated federal environmental laws, endangered public health, and attempted to conceal your actions. The fact that you were trying to save money is not a mitigating factor. It's an aggravating one. You knew the right thing to do. You knew there were required procedures, and you chose to ignore them for financial convenience." Judge Walsh sentenced Margaret to 20 months in federal prison, 3 years of supervised release, and $50,000 in fines. She was also ordered to pay restitution for the cleanup costs, though that would be joint and several with the HOA, since they were the responsible party. The 2 board members received lighter sentences, 12 months each, which the judge suspended in favor of home confinement and community service, plus 5 years of probation. They'd cooperated fully with the investigation and had less direct culpability than Margaret. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief that justice had been served, anger that it had happened at all, satisfaction that Margaret would face real consequences, but also sadness that it had come to this. A woman's life was effectively over because she'd made selfish, stupid decisions and refused to admit she was wrong until it was too late. My lot was finally cleared in November. The EPA issued a closure letter confirming that all contaminated material had been removed and the property was safe for use. I stood on that empty dirt looking at the same scrub brush and desert sand that had been there before, except now I knew the full story of what had happened here. Joe came over while I was standing there. "You going to build your workshop now?" he asked. "Eventually. I need some time to forget about all this first." "You did the right thing, you know. Calling the EPA, pushing for accountability. A lot of people would have just accepted the settlement and moved on. She was poisoning people. Someone had to stop her." "True, but still it took guts. Margaret had a lot of power around here, and you went up against her. Not everyone would do that." We stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun set over the desert. The sky turned brilliant shades of orange and pink, the kind of sunset that makes you remember why people live in Arizona despite the heat. Over the following months, life slowly returned to normal. The new HOA board was competent and careful, checking and rechecking every decision, terrified of making the same mistakes. They hired a property management company to handle day-to-day operations and implemented new oversight procedures. No more unilateral decisions by the president. Everything required board approval with documented minutes. I started getting estimates for my workshop in spring 2027. The EPA closure letter had actually increased my property value because it meant the land had been thoroughly tested and certified clean. Very few properties could make that claim. I ran into Margaret's daughter one day at the grocery store in March. I recognized her from photos I'd seen during the investigation. She was in her 30s, looked tired. "Mr. Ingram?" she said hesitantly. "I'm Emily Henderson, Margaret's daughter. I know who you are. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what my mom did. I know it doesn't change anything, but I want you to know that she's not a bad person. She just made really terrible choices." I looked at this woman, clearly struggling with her mother's imprisonment, and softened a little. I know she's not evil, but she did real harm and refused to take responsibility until she had no choice. I hope she uses her time in prison to think about why she made those choices. She does. She writes me letters, and all she talks about is regret, how she wishes she could go back and do things differently, how she didn't realize how dangerous asbestos was until the EPA explained it to her. She thought it was just an outdated regulation. That's the problem. She didn't care enough to find out. She assumed she knew better than the experts, better than the regulations, better than everyone. That kind of arrogance is dangerous. Emily nodded sadly. You're right. I just hope someday she can find a way to make amends. She can start by fully cooperating with the restitution payments and by being honest with anyone who asks about what she did. Own it completely. That's the only path to redemption. We parted on civil terms, and I thought about that conversation for days afterward. It's easy to demonize people who do wrong, to turn them into villains in our stories. But Margaret was a human being who'd made catastrophically bad choices and was now paying the price. She'd let ego and stubbornness override common sense and safety. That didn't make her irredeemably evil, but it did make her dangerous in a position of power. The final chapter of the story came in May 2027, almost exactly a year after the dump trucks had first appeared on my lot. The Saguaro Heights HOA held their annual meeting, and I attended for the first time in years. The new board gave a presentation on everything that had happened, the steps they'd taken to prevent similar incidents, and their vision for the community going forward. At the end, Sarah, the new president, asked me to come to the front. I want to publicly acknowledge Xavier Ingram, she said. When he discovered what the previous board had done, he could have stayed quiet, taken a settlement, and moved on. Instead, he reported it to the EPA and pursued accountability. Because of his actions, a dangerous situation was properly remediated. Responsible parties faced justice, and this community is now safer and better managed. We owe him our thanks. The room erupted in applause. People I barely knew came up afterward to shake my hand, to thank me, to share their own stories of frustration with Margaret's leadership. It was overwhelming and humbling. An older woman, probably in her 70s, grabbed my arm as I was leaving. My grandson has asthma, she said. He plays in our yard every weekend. If those asbestos fibers had spread through the neighborhood, I don't know what would have happened to him. You protected him. You protected all of us. Thank you. That's when it really hit me. This hadn't just been about my property or my rights. It had been about public health, about safety, about protecting vulnerable people from the consequences of someone else's recklessness. Margaret had gambled with lives to save money, and if I hadn't pushed back, who knows how many people might have been exposed. I drove home that night feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Genuine pride. Not in a boastful way, but in the quiet knowledge that I'd done the right thing even when it was difficult, even when it would have been easier to look the other way. My workshop broke ground in June 2027. It was a simple structure, just a large garage with plenty of space for my woodworking equipment and tools. But standing there watching the foundation being poured on land that had been contaminated and was now clean, I felt hopeful about the future. The contractor doing the work was new to the area, and he asked about the EPA closure letter I'd had to provide. What's the story there? He said. Don't see those very often. I told him the whole thing. He listened with increasing amazement. So the HOA president went to prison for dumping asbestos on your lot? 20 months in federal prison. She'll be out in about 6 more months if she gets good behavior credits. And you're the one who caught her? I'm the one who called the EPA and provided the evidence. They did the rest. He shook his head. Man, that's something. You're like a one-man environmental protection agency. I laughed. I just didn't want poison on my property. The rest followed from there. The workshop was completed in August. It was perfect. Everything I'd envisioned. Good lighting, climate control for the brutal Arizona summers, plenty of storage and workspace. I spent my first day in there just organizing tools and supplies, savoring the satisfaction of a project completed. Joe came over for the unofficial opening, bringing beer and offering a toast. To new beginnings, he said, and to standing up for what's right even when it's hard. We clinked bottles and drank. You ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't caught them? Joe asked. I mean, there were 3 other lots on that list. They would have dumped on all of them. I think about it sometimes. And I think about the workers who handled that material without proper protection because they were told it was safe. At least one of them is suing the HOA now for endangerment. He's developed respiratory problems. Is that related to the asbestos? Maybe, maybe not. It's only been a year, and asbestos-related diseases usually take decades to develop. But the uncertainty is enough. He'll have to worry about it for the rest of his life. We sat in silence, contemplating the ripples of Margaret's decision. One choice to skip a $1,500 inspection had cascaded into hundreds of thousands in costs, multiple people facing prison time, a worker's health potentially compromised, and a community's trust shattered. "You know what the worst part is?" Joe said. "She probably still doesn't really get it. People like that, they think they're the victim. They focus on the punishment they're facing and not on the harm they caused." Her daughter said Margaret writes letters full of regret. "Words are easy. Real change is hard. We'll see what she's like when she gets out." As summer turned to fall, 2027, I settled into a comfortable routine. I'd work on projects in my workshop, take care of my house, occasionally attend HOA meetings to stay informed. The new board was boring in the best possible way. They followed procedures, did required inspections, communicated clearly with homeowners. There was no drama, no surprises, no illegal dumping. In October, I got a letter forwarded from my attorney. It was from Margaret, postmarked from the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California, where she was serving her sentence. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened it carefully. "Dear Mr. Ingram," it began, "I understand you have no obligation to read this letter or to care about what I have to say. You owe me nothing, but I need to try to express something that I haven't been able to articulate in court or in any official setting. I am genuinely, deeply sorry for what I did to you. Not just sorry that I got caught or that I'm in prison, but truly remorseful for the harm I caused. I've had a lot of time to think over the past months. Too much time, really. I think about those dump trucks on your property, about the asbestos fibers that could have made people sick, about how I dismissed your concerns and treated you like an annoyance. I was wrong. Completely, inexcusably wrong. I told myself I was being practical, that I was doing what was best for the HOA, but the truth is I was being cheap and lazy and arrogant. I didn't want to deal with the possibility that there might be asbestos because it would have been expensive and complicated. So I just pretended it wasn't a problem. That's not leadership. That's cowardice. I've learned a lot about asbestos since then. The EPA made me attend educational programs as part of my plea deal. I know now about the diseases it causes, about the latency periods, about how even brief exposures can be dangerous. I know that people who develop mesothelioma from asbestos exposure suffer terribly and die slowly. I know that I could have caused that. The reality of what I risked keeps me awake at night. I'm not writing this to ask for forgiveness or sympathy. I know I don't deserve either. I just want you to know that your actions, while they destroyed my life in many ways, also saved me from causing even more harm. If you hadn't reported it, I would have dumped on 3 more lots, more exposure, more risk, more people endangered. You stopped me, and while I hated you for it at the time, I'm grateful now. I hope your property has been fully restored and that you've been able to move on with your life. I hope the people in Saguaro Heights are safer now. And I hope that someday I can find a way to contribute something positive to the world that outweighs the harm I've caused. Again, I'm truly sorry. Margaret Henderson. I read the letter 3 times. It seemed genuine, though it was hard to know for sure. People in prison have lots of time to craft contrite messages, but there was something in the specificity of her remorse, the way she identified exactly what she'd done wrong, that rang true. I didn't respond to the letter. I wasn't ready for that, and I wasn't sure I'd ever be. But I kept it in a drawer, a reminder that people are complicated, and that even those who do harm can potentially learn and grow. In December 2027, I was contacted by a journalist from an environmental watchdog organization. They were doing a feature on citizen enforcement of environmental laws, cases where ordinary people had blown the whistle on violations when authorities weren't paying attention. "Your case is a perfect example," the journalist said. "You weren't an expert. You didn't have special training. You just noticed something wrong and followed through." They interviewed me for over an hour, asking detailed questions about the timeline, my decision-making process, what advice I'd have for others in similar situations. "What would you say was the key moment?" the journalist asked. The point where you decided this was bigger than just a property dispute? I thought about it. When my neighbor mentioned asbestos. Before that, I was just angry about them dumping trash on my lot. But once I understood it might be hazardous materials, it became about public safety. That changed everything. And the documents you found in the HOA office? Those were crucial. Without that proof that they'd deliberately skipped the inspection, it would have been harder to establish intent. They could have claimed ignorance. The emails showed they knew what they were supposed to do and chose not to do it. The article came out in February 2028. It was a long, detailed piece that used my case as the centerpiece of a broader discussion about environmental enforcement. The headline was, "When Citizens Become Watchdogs: How Ordinary People Are Protecting Communities from Toxic Threats." Several other cases were profiled alongside mine. A teacher in Oregon who'd discovered illegal pesticide use near her school. A retiree in Florida who'd exposed a contractor dumping construction waste in wetlands. A nurse in Pennsylvania who'd blown the whistle on a hospital incinerator releasing dioxins. All regular people who'd noticed something wrong and refused to look away. The article generated significant attention. I got emails from people across the country, some sharing their own stories, others asking for advice on situations they were facing. I tried to respond to as many as I could, always emphasizing the same points. Document everything, follow proper channels, get expert help when needed, and don't back down even when it's uncomfortable. One email particularly stood out. It was from a woman in Austin, Texas, dealing with her own HOA nightmare. They'd authorized construction of a retention pond on common land without proper engineering studies, and she suspected it was contaminating groundwater. "I've been trying to raise concerns for months," she wrote, "but the board ignores me. They say I'm being hysterical. Reading about your case gave me courage. I'm going to contact the state environmental agency tomorrow. Thank you for showing me it's possible to fight back." I wrote back immediately, encouraging her and offering to connect her with Melissa, my attorney, who might know environmental lawyers in Texas. A few months later, she emailed again to say the state had opened an investigation and preliminary tests showed elevated bacteria levels in the groundwater. The pond was being shut down pending a full environmental impact study. "You helped me save my neighborhood," she wrote. "I can never thank you enough." That's when I realized this story wasn't really about me or Margaret or even asbestos. It was about the importance of civic engagement, of paying attention, of being willing to be inconvenient when something is wrong. It was about the responsibility we all have to protect our communities and hold institutions accountable. Margaret was released from federal prison in April 2028, having served 17 months of her 20-month sentence. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd moved in with her daughter in Tucson, about 2 hours south of Phoenix. She was working at a nonprofit that helped low-income homeowners with repairs and weatherization. Apparently she was quiet, kept her head down, did her work. She'd never returned to any position of authority in an HOA. That much was certain. Her conviction ensured that. I thought about reaching out, maybe responding to her letter, but decided against it. We didn't need closure or reconciliation. What had happened had happened. She'd faced consequences, I'd been made whole, the community was safer. That was enough. My workshop became my sanctuary, the place where I processed everything that had happened. I built cabinets for my house, a bookshelf for Joe, a toy chest for a neighbor's grandkids. Working with wood, creating something solid and real from raw materials, was therapeutic in a way I hadn't expected. In June 2028, 2 years after the dump trucks had first appeared, the Saguaro Heights HOA held a community appreciation event. They'd established an annual award in my name, the Xavier Ingram Community Service Award, given to residents who went above and beyond to improve and protect the neighborhood. I gave a short speech at the event, talking about the importance of vigilance and courage, about speaking up even when it's easier to stay silent, about the responsibility we have to each other as neighbors and community members. What happened 2 years ago was a crisis, I said, but it was also an opportunity to reset expectations, to recommit to doing things right, to prioritize safety and transparency over convenience and cost-cutting. The new board has done an excellent job of seizing that opportunity. This is a better community now than it was before. Not because of what I did, but because all of you demanded change and held your leaders accountable. The applause was warm and genuine. Later, people shared stories with me about other improvements that had been made: better communication from the board, more inclusive decision-making, regular financial audits, proper maintenance of common areas. The Margaret Henderson debacle had been a wake-up call, and the community had responded positively. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the strange journey the past 2 years had been. I'd bought a vacant lot planning to build a workshop someday. Instead, I'd exposed environmental crimes, battled an HOA president, worked with federal agents, testified at hearings, and become an unlikely advocate for citizen enforcement of environmental laws. The workshop was built now, better than I'd originally imagined. My property was clean and certified safe. Margaret was in prison and then released, facing the consequences of her choices. The community was stronger and more engaged. Justice, in its imperfect way, had been served. I pulled into my driveway and looked at my house, my workshop, my restored vacant lot. This was home, a place I'd fought for and protected. The desert sunset painted everything in golden light, beautiful and harsh and unforgiving, just like the truth. Joe waved from his yard. I waved back. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful. No dump trucks, no hazmat crews, no federal agents, just ordinary life, which was exactly what it should be. I walked into my workshop, flipped on the lights, and stood in that clean, well-organized space I'd built on land that had once been contaminated. This was the victory, not dramatic or flashy, but real. A place to create, to work, to build things that would last. The asbestos was gone, the contamination was remediated, the responsible parties had been held accountable, and I had my workshop, my property, my peace of mind. Sometimes doing the right thing means making a phone call no one else wants to make. Sometimes it means standing up to people who have power when you have none. Sometimes it means being patient through investigations and legal proceedings and cleanup operations that take months or years. But in the end, it's worth it. Because homes and neighborhoods and communities are worth fighting for. Because people's health and safety matter more than convenience or money. Because someone has to be willing to say, "This is wrong," and mean it. I was that someone for Saguaro Heights. And now, 2 years later, standing in my workshop on a June evening with the desert breeze blowing through, I knew I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. The EPA documentation sits in a file cabinet in my house. The settlement agreement is in another folder. Photos of the cleanup are on my computer. Evidence of everything that happened, preserved for history or future reference, or just peace of mind. But mostly, I don't think about it anymore. I think about the cabinet I'm building, the friend I'm helping with repairs, the community events I attend. I think about ordinary life in an ordinary neighborhood where people look out for each other and hold their leaders accountable. That's the real ending to this story. Not dramatic confrontation or cinematic justice, but the quiet satisfaction of a problem solved, a wrong righted, a community protected, and a workshop full of possibility, built on clean ground, ready for whatever comes next.